Chapter 13, the Renaissance in Europe, and we're going to deal today with a section entitled Social Change. This section is going to take us through the Renaissance's impact in education, in politics, in gender issues, in literacy, ultimately even in ethnicity and race. Some of these issues were affected directly by the Renaissance ideas. Other things are just happening alongside the Renaissance and don't really have anything to do with the core intellectual concepts of the Renaissance. So I'll point out which ones we're dealing with as we get them. So Section A, Education and Political Thought. The Renaissance was big on education, as you've already heard. Learning the classics, being well-rounded and educated is important. And a Renaissance humanist by the name of Paul Vergerio wrote some things that build on that idea. So first of all, he said that education is a legitimate interest of the state, meaning that it's the job of the governments to make sure that its citizens are well educated. It's not just the duty of parents and the family, it's the job of the state. So this is long before we had public schools. You have someone saying something like this: it makes better citizens, better people, you can't just leave it to chance. He also, Vergerio, said that we ought to be like good Renaissance humanists. We ought to learn history, that boys ought to learn public speaking, ethics, but he built all this on these two final concepts, that ultimately education needs to be fundamentally about the respect of parents and elders. And you can ask yourself, is that still a part of our philosophy of education today? Do we have that or not? And the second thing is we need respect for God and God's laws, the Ten Commandments. If we have education based on respect for elders and respect for the Ten Commandments, this is what it's all about. And again, you can ask yourself, is that appropriate? Do we have that today? Is it even something we should be talking about? Now, the most influential book written that affected manners and education and polite society was a book by an Italian humanist named Baldassare Castiglione. It's a mouthful, it's a good name, and he wrote The Book of the Courtier. And this book, and we'll read a portion of it in class, as we often do, is a manual on how to be a well-rounded Renaissance gentleman. And this book was widely read in the time. It's advice. It's advice to young men on how to take these new ideas that have been floating around Renaissance Europe and make them very practical. What do you got to do to be a good, well-rounded man in society? The ideal gentleman. That's the topics of his book. And he says you got to be good at just about everything. This is no surprise. You need to be able to fight. You need to be able to read poetry, play music, write a song, be good at conversation, know how to be funny, be well educated, know the classics, maybe know a second or third language. You need to be well traveled. This is a handbook on how to be a gentleman. And here's a word that you should know for the courtier. It's not in the textbook. The word is sprezzatura. I'll spell it for you. Sprezzatura. It's an Italian word that he wrote. He goes, you need this. And this is the act of making all of those things that we just talked about, they have to look easy for you. It's not just that you know how to do all these things and you're good at everything. That's not even, you have to do all that and make it look easy, like it just came naturally to you. So we'll talk in class about whether we have changing standards for gentlemen and ladies today, or are they kind of similar to Castiglione? And you'll read more specifically about him in a little while. Section 3, Education and Women. So the impact of the Renaissance in the education of women was good if you were an upper-class girl. Rich girls, affluent girls, were educated the same as boys. They were taught the classics. They were taught Latin. They were very well educated, just like the boys. In fact, some women, like Isabella d'Este, who I think we talked about a couple sections ago, even went on to rule little city-states when their husbands died early or something like that. There were even famous women painters of the Renaissance. A woman named Artemisia Gentileschi comes to mind. Her name is in the textbook, and if you need to spell it, you can look that one up. So for affluent girls, the Renaissance was a real step forward educationally. There's even an example of a woman named Laura Serrata, talked about in your textbook here, who was a remarkable woman who lived an incredible life, was educated, and was actually married at the age of 15, but then her husband died when she was 18. And so rather than being stuck in marriage and raising kids for the rest of her life, she had this career as an intellectual. And she was an early feminist, we would call her. They didn't use that word at that time, but she spoke for the rights of women. Here's a good quote from her. She's talking about married women who no longer are able to use their intellect, but just simply raise kids. Of these women, she says, these women of majestic pride, outlandish ornament, and necks bound with gold or pearls, bear the glittering symbols of their captivity to men. So she was kind of down on other women, saying, look, it's your own fault. She didn't blame men. She actually said this is the fault of women, that they're condemned to this second-class status. So Laura Serrata, very interesting, maybe not typical, but educated, literate, wrote letters and books, and yet, not too many were like her. Overall, though, the education that women received, and it was relatively equivalent to upper-class boys, that education was not to be used for political or public service. The women's role was to use that education to be decorative. That's the word. Domestic, decorative. There's no political role for women. There's no public role, no power, real power. There's behind-the-scenes power, but not public power. It's to attract artists to your husband's court, to be gracious and beautiful and well-spoken, and know how to serve those purposes. Managing of the court of your husband, knowing about art, knowing how to converse with other high status people. This was what's important for a woman of the Renaissance, but no role in public affairs. It's almost like the First Lady, at least historic First Ladies, typically had that role. They're very educated women in American history that have been First Ladies, but very little public role. That's the same kind of thing. All right, we'll talk more about women here in just a second. Let's move on to politics. The most important work of political science up to this point, maybe one of the top few ever, is a book by Niccolo Machiavelli, The Prince, Il Principe. And this is the first book of genuine modern political science. It's a groundbreaking landmark work where he describes for the first time politics as it really is. Prior to this, people that wrote about politics always had a really idealistic image of it, that everybody's a good Christian, that God is at the top of this pyramid, and the nobles and the kings are all Christians, and they're all following the laws of God, and this whole, it's a very perfect, rosy, ideal picture. So if we all just behave like that, these previous authors had said, life will go great. And it was all based on that frame of mind. Machiavelli comes along and says, that is not how the real world works. Not everyone's a good boy or a good girl, and it's dirty. And here's how it really works. So the goals of politics really are to keep and to increase power. That's what was really happening in the world around us. Open your eyes, people. It's reality versus idealism, and he chooses to write about the reality of what's being played out in the city-states of Italy, which you already know were a mess. It's a political jungle. They're not getting along. They're not all good Christians. You've got popes with grandchildren. You've got people committing murder one day and sponsoring beautiful works of art the next. It's not this picture-perfect scene. So he talks in his book about the need to be, as a political leader, to be like the fox and also like the lion. And you can imagine the characteristics of each animal and how they're very different, the fox and the lion. So think about that. He talked about the need from time to time to be amoral, A-M-O-R-A-L, not to always be this perfect moral leader, but you got to get in the weeds. You got to get your hands dirty sometimes to do what works, to be effective. He talked about this is the way people can be versus the way they should be. It's different. What you should be is always good maybe, but what you need to be when times are tough, you got to be other than good. That's a famous quote. Sometimes you have to learn to be other than good because people have an evil, wicked human nature. They don't trust you. They don't always obey you. People are trying to manipulate you, and so you got to play that game. And at the end of the day, it's probably better to be feared than to be loved. Famous quote. So, what's the test of a good government? It's effective. They keep power, they expand power. That's what makes it effective. The end justifies the means. The means are the way you go about it. Sometimes those change. If the end result is good, it doesn't matter how you got there. He said a famous quote in his book, "A prince needs to know how to go to hell and come back out of it." So you got to know the good and the bad. It's a sort of a cynical take on politics. People say it's very modern. The word Machiavellian has come to mean cynical, modern, backroom deals. But you'll read a bit of it in class, and you can decide for yourself. But either way, that's written here in the Renaissance for the first time, a very modern work of politics. The section on the printed word. So at the same time as the Renaissance is playing out, the mechanical printing press makes its debut in Europe through the work of Johannes Gutenberg, a German in around 1454. It reinvents mechanical print and type. This originally came from China, sort of been lost, the recipe, so to speak, but now it comes back. So now you have a mechanical printing press in Europe, and this revolutionizes life. First of all, the first book that's going to be printed is the Bible. And so now you got the Bible in mass print going to lots of places in Europe. This is going to help spark the Reformation and the work of Martin Luther. Secondly, it changes the way people communicate with their government. The government can now get information to people on a big scale for the first time. Imagine, when the internet was first born, or Twitter, or some revolution in communication. This is that generation's equivalent. The government can manipulate people through propaganda. People can also do this to one another. You can be an author, a printer. This is now, you can join a cause. Political parties form because now you can get information to people other than word of mouth. It's a very modern innovation, very radical. And maybe the most important thing it did is it made people read more and learn more. And you have a rise of literacy in all subjects, in all social classes, particularly people that aren't priests, because this is the group that's now reading in mass for the first time. Books on all subjects are published in the aftermath of the printing press. Medical books, travel books, marriage advice, not just religious books. The subject matter increases and diversifies tremendously. So it leads to an increase in learning. We call it among lay people, people that aren't priests. Radical stuff, all right? Women in work. So, what's going on with women in the Renaissance? Well, we just talked about upper class women. Now this talks about everybody else. So for middle and working class women, they do not really experience the Renaissance at all. So what we're about to talk about in terms of their work has almost nothing to do with the Renaissance. It's just what's going on already. So women of the working class perform a wide variety of jobs. Lots of things, from making sails of ships to working in the textile industry, working at running ferry service, agricultural tasks, helping in their husbands' shops and businesses. Obviously, the traditional professions like midwives, who help are like nurses that help women give birth, maids, cooks, laundry, servants, slaves, household work. It's all over the map for middle and working class women. Totally unrelated to the Renaissance, but a huge variety of jobs. Everyone needs money. Men's work of the working class usually wasn't enough to put food on the table, so even mothers are working. So lots of diverse work. Now, if you're an upper class woman, you don't work. That's the whole thing. You're decorative. You're educated but decorative. So the author of our textbook, and most people agree, the status of upper class women declined because of this. They were educated, but they couldn't use it for anything real. It was just this household and domestic role as managers, entertainers, to be charming and affable, but not to be in power. So it's a very busy and complex life for upper class women. They were managing very complicated courts and households with maybe up to hundreds of employees and slaves. Very busy, very, very important work, but not political work. Incredible responsibility, actually. If you read the section of the textbook, it'll tell you all the different things that upper class women were doing, but again, just not political. So the status of women is dropping of the upper class. How does this play out in terms of culture and laws regarding women? So there's this thing in history that perpetuates in the Renaissance and maybe even in the present day called the double standard, in which men are culturally, it's acceptable culturally for men to pursue relationships outside of marriage, but it's not okay for women to do that. That was pretty much the standard of the Renaissance as well. And we maybe will discuss in class, or you at least can think right now, how true is this double standard in modern society? Or is it okay when women are found to have relationships outside of their marriage, or not? And what about men? What about men in politics? So many examples there. Is this fair or not? Moving on, the legal approach to women. Crimes against women were not treated very seriously in the Renaissance. It was not a serious crime, for example, for rape was not a serious crime. It was mild penalties associated with this, where stealing was much more of a serious crime, punishable by, losing a hand or something. But crimes against women, typically not. So again, status of women, according to most historians, is dropping during the Renaissance, somewhat unrelated to it, somewhat related to it. Last section is kind of totally different, deals with slavery and ethnicity. This is the period of history where the slave trade really moves into Africa. Europeans have always had slaves. There's always been slaves in Europe. The Greeks had slaves. The Romans had slaves. The word slave means Slavic, Slav. It means you came from Eastern Europe. These are the traditional sources of slaves. So in most of European history, slaves were from Eastern Europe, or the Balkans, north of Greece. They were Eastern European and they were white. So only now, in around 1450, 1500 or so, does the slave trade move toward Africa. And the Portuguese are the first to start it. The Portuguese started the African slave trade out of Lisbon. You can see on this map, they go down and start that first slave trade. Even at the peak of the Portuguese slave trade, they're transporting, in around 1530, they're transporting about 4,000 to 5,000 slaves per year out of Africa. Very few end up in Europe. That's kind of the key here. Most slaves from Africa end up in the so-called New World, either in South America, Central America, or North America. And this becomes such a huge part of American history. And obviously you'll get to that in the future, or you've learned it already. We'll save a lot of that for those classes. So what is the role of these African rulers in the slave trade? Well, they're complicit, which means they participate. Slavery had long been a thing in Africa, just like it had been a thing in Europe, and there was no real respect for fellow tribesmen or anything like that, or different tribes in Africa. According to the research that we've got, the local rulers helped round up slaves and sell them off to the Europeans to make a profit. So everybody's complicit in this. There was a long tradition of Africans enslaving other Africans, just like Europeans had enslaved other Europeans. So this was not a new thing. The new thing was that it was one continent to another, and there's a lot more money involved. So again, very few slaves from Africa end up in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe. A lot of slaves will end up in Spain and Portugal, but not so much up in England and France. And so the ones that make it up there experience life that's not as harsh, perhaps, as slavery it becomes in the United States. It's not that plantation, physical, farming type labor that we so associate with slavery in American history. It was relatively benign, if you can say that, about slavery, and our book does. There were no major slave revolts in Europe, so you know that it wasn't perhaps as bad or prevalent or widespread as it is in our story. So the Europeans' attitude toward Africans really was they were objects of curiosity, they were exotic, they were symbols of wealth, and it was all part of this materialistic culture of the Renaissance that you want to acquire possessions and kind of show them off. So slaves, almost like women in the Renaissance, were to be decorative, and that's part of the role that they played. So we'll talk more about slavery as the chapters go on and we get into the Spanish as well. But for now, just know that it starts both with Portuguese, very few end up in Europe, and slaves are symbols of wealth.